A lot of people have started rolling in. I'm going to start getting this going so that we can dive into the content. But before that, for those participants on, welcome. Glad you joined us today. At AAD, we're excited to kind of continue to put out different programming, different topics that touch on a variety of measures throughout the state that affect both the practitioners and the service providers. And so that's kind of our goal here, is just to continue that process. A few housekeeping items. As the panel goes on and you come up or you start to think of good questions, please enter those into the chat. Sean, who's our moderator, will kind of curate those and be able to ask the panel as appropriate. And then from there, I'm just going to introduce you to our moderator, Sean Gallagher. Sean Gallagher is the host and author of a storytelling podcast, Montana 3000. He's an Arizona native. Sean has a degree, an English degree from the U.S. Naval Academy, and a master's degree in philosophy from ASU. Past jobs would include everything from naval officer, box handler, diplomat. I love this, twice failed startup entrepreneur, and a cannabis company exec, to name a few. Now he's this really great writer, and he lives up in Montana with his wife and kids. Sean, take it away.
All right, thank you, Chad. Well, welcome to everybody. It's a thrill to be here, and I know we're going to have a great conversation today, led by our panel, who I'd like to introduce to everybody right now. So our first panelist is Demitri Downing. Demitri is a former prosecutor who's played a leading role in the development of the medical marijuana industry for over a decade. He lobbies in multiple states for pro-industry changes to the law and has helped develop numerous dispensaries and cultivation operations. He's also the founder of MITA, a nationwide cannabis conference and expo. So welcome, Demitri. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
Lindsay Schube. Lindsay Schube is an avid outdoors person who can be found skiing, golfing, running, and hiking when she's not doing her day job as a real estate attorney, specializing in land use for Gamage and Burnham. She assists clients in the medical marijuana industry with a primary focus on land use and permitting issues with local cities and counties. When she's not playing outdoors or working, Lindsay spends her time with her husband and 3 children. Thank you for joining, Lindsay. Welcome. Kris Krane. Kris is the co-founder and president of Forefront Ventures, a leading investment and operations firm in the legal cannabis industry. Prior to his work at Forefront, Kris was the associate director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, more commonly known as NORML, and then the executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the largest student organization in the United States. When not helping end cannabis prohibition or building a new industry from its ashes, you can find Kris spending time with his family and young children. He bleeds New York Mets blue and orange. Welcome, Kris. And finally,
thank you.
Andrew, good to see you. And finally, Andrew Trippel. Andrew's the supervising planner for the city of Santa Rosa, California, spending much of his career in Memphis after graduating from the University of Memphis. Andrew worked for ULI, the University of Memphis, and LRK, an architecture, design, and planning firm, before moving west and joining the city of Santa Rosa as city planner in 2016. He's since moved up the ranks and has recently become the city's supervisor for planning. Really glad to have you. Thanks for joining, Andrew. All right, so this is a fantastic panel, and we're going to have a great conversation. And I'd like to start it off with a question posed to Kris. As we narrow our focus today down to the state and municipal level here, why don't we start off with a broader view? And Kris, I wonder if you couldn't maybe begin by giving us a few minutes of thought on what's happening nationally in the cannabis industry that is impacting the states in such a way that they're now empowered to be passing legislation like the sort that Arizona recently passed.
Sure. So, I think the reality is the states have been much further ahead of the federal government by and large, right? The push towards legalization has happened largely at the state level. There's been very little movement at the federal level by and large, although a lot more in the last couple of years than we had ever seen previously. And having worked for normal SSDP, or I worked on this on the policy level throughout the aughts, I take a pretty long view of what's happening, in the issue legislatively. The legalization drive has largely been led by advocacy organizations that push ballot initiatives in states that have a ballot initiative process. The way that this has gone has largely mirrored how medical marijuana progressed, where you started in the Western states where there's more acceptance and where you have an easier ballot initiative process, then goes to some of the Eastern states that have ballot initiative processes, of which there's not that many. And then once you've done it in a number of states, then state legislatures start coming around and passing their own state legislative bills, as we've now seen in places like Illinois, Vermont, Virginia, New York, and a few others. But it took the voters demonstrating to the politicians that this was politically palatable for politicians to actually act on this. So we're now starting to see that trickle up to Washington, D.C., where the House of Representatives last year passed the MORE Act, which is effectively a legalization bill. It died in the then Republican-controlled Senate. The House also last year passed safe banking, which would legalize access to banking for cannabis businesses. Happy to report that that bill just repassed the House of Representatives yesterday by a very wide margin, a lot of Republican votes. So this was very much a bipartisan measure. That now heads to the Senate, which is where everybody's really watching, right? Because we've not had a situation where the Democrats have had control of both houses and the White House in quite some time. And I say this not to try and make this a partisan issue. It really isn't. As I mentioned, we had a lot of Republican support for the Banking Act in the House. This has become an issue that the Democratic Party has largely embraced. For the Republican Party, it's not so much a partisan issue as it is a generational issue. And the older Republicans, and particularly older Republicans in leadership, by and large, have not gotten on board with this. And unfortunately, Republicans in leadership in Washington, D.C., tend to be septuagenarian at their youngest. And so, not exactly our target demographic for legalization. So the question is, what is the Senate going to do now? And, I think safe banking is kind of our lowest hanging fruit currently. I do believe that it will pass the Senate this year. I think it's more a matter of timing and vehicle than whether or not it's going to pass. I don't think it's going to get a vote that quickly in the Senate because of the political dynamics. What you have right now is Senator Schumer and Senator Booker are about to introduce a new legalization bill. We'll call it MORE Act 2.0, right? It's probably going to include everything in the MORE Act and then some more on top of it. Don't know exactly what that's going to look like. You have senators on the left, particularly folks like Senator Booker, who don't want to do banking first because they don't think it does enough to address issues of social equity and taking care of communities that have been most disproportionately impacted by prohibition. And so I think what's going to happen is the Senate will likely push for broader reform first. If we're fortunate enough to get it, that solves banking too. So happy day. I don't think that that's going to happen, however, because I don't think we have 50 votes in the Senate, let alone the 60 that we would need to get a standalone pass. So once it becomes clear that that can't pass, I think the Senate then turns back to banking either as a standalone as it currently sits, or as a piece of a much broader spending bill that they'll likely need to pass later on in the year. But that would be a huge benefit to the industry. It would mean, access to bank accounts that are currently unavailable, access to loans, small business loans, mostly from local banks. I think it'll mean a wave of new capital investment into the industry from some institutions, but mostly from high net worth individuals who've been sitting on the sidelines. It means the ability for dispensaries to accept credit cards and traditional form of payments at their stores. And so it would be a real game changer for the industry. And there's still a possibility we get more out of this Congress before the end of the session next year. But I think that's the lowest hanging fruit and the most likely reform that we're likely to see at the federal level this year.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great insights. Thanks. You talk about some of the, there's hesitancy on the part of some quarters about legalization. And I wonder, Demitri, maybe this is a good question for you to pick up, but what does legalization mean for the state of Arizona? How do you envision tax revenues being applied? And how do you, in your role as a lobbyist, but more broadly as a cannabis industry professional, how do you get people comfortable with the benefits of cannabis, legalized cannabis, when there are, as Kris points out, some pretty deeply entrenched opinions against?
Yeah, and if I just may real quickly, Mexico is doing full adult use this September. Canada is adult use. The trend is international. So the pressure is going to be coming not just from within the United States, just to add to what Kris was saying, not just from within, state by state, and the pressure rising up, but from international movements as well. So the trend worldwide is towards ending prohibition as a management model. The most important thing for people to remember, and I'm not a cannabis consumer myself. I came into the industry with kind of a fuddy-duddy mentality as an ex-prosecutor, economic development specialist out of Tucson in 2012. Since then, I've become a regulatory, licensing, market structure specialist in cannabis. The most important thing to remember for anyone, and I tell this to people all the time, if you hate marijuana, if you think it's a devil's weed that caused the death of your son, tax, regulate, educate, eradicate. If you love marijuana and you think it's the salvation for the world, I mean, these are extremes that really don't mean anything. Tax, regulate, educate, participate. So in no world does prohibition exist as a model to manage cannabis policy. It just doesn't make any sense. The concept of prohibition is an antiquated notion that should not be used ever for anything. Education is the key, and choice is like our God-given right. So that's a message that I've been sending to people as I've been educating some of these individuals that might be more entrenched on prohibition. There's another way, on cannabis policy. There's a better way to handle it, and that's tax, regulate, educate, eradicate. Because we know that prior to 2010, when Arizona had its second medical marijuana passage, and the industry began, we know that 10% of the Arizona public participated in some sort of capacity, therapeutic, medicinal, recreational, in cannabis, and they were participating and risking their own, freedoms from 1970 to 2010. So, if I may, in Arizona passed medicinal in 2010. The market began in 2012, and then it graduated to adult use in just January. And along those during that time, an incredible amount of economic opportunity and possibility has been realized by different jurisdictions. And those jurisdictions that adopted models that supported and enhanced the retail or the manufacturing or the cultivation have realized more jobs and more tax benefits from those from the existence of those businesses within their communities. Some 15,000 people now in Arizona work directly for medicinal, now adult use, adult choice, I like to say, marijuana facilities, and tens of thousands of other individuals work and support ancillary auxiliary roles. So, and that's without any new messaging, marketing or advertising or messaging. And if I may leave you with one last thing here, the most important thing to remember is that, the cannabis industry, the marijuana industry, and I always say marijuana because it allows you to communicate in a better way with the old fuddy-duddies that have these antiquated notions, even though it's a politically incorrect term. Because if you walk into their office and say, I want to talk to you about cannabis policy, they think that you're automatically trying to spin them. So I always use a term that they're familiar with. And they don't use the word marijuana because it's some racist thing against Mexicans. That's just what they're used to. But, oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I jumped to another thing. So there's just so much to talk about, but go ahead.
No, that was helpful. Thank you. So, Lindsay, question for you. You are deeply ensconced in the nuts and bolts of executing cannabis policy. What are you seeing from your clients, from the interactions that you're having at the municipal level, at the state level? What's the general temperature of folks as we prepare for implementing adult use in Arizona?
Thanks, Sean. Great question. And yeah, I get the privilege and pleasure of working with folks like Andrew, but in Arizona, all of our planning and government staff officials. I also work with the Department of Health Services and then electeds. And I would say that, just when we got to a point when medical was normalized and people were feeling really good about medical and people were comfortable, the safety, the security, the implementation of the program, well, then we drop in adult use. And whether we want to call it establishment locations, adult use, rec, whatever your terminology is. I think in the state of Arizona, there's still a lot of trepidation. I don't think people appreciate and understand the safety and security. I think, all of us can talk about how valuable of an asset this is, and so what I continue to remind elected officials is this is too valuable of an asset to screw up and sell weed to a 16-year-old. You talk about a dispensary being close to a preschool. Well, little Joey, who's 6, is not going to get out of the preschool, walk to the dispensary, roll out a joint, and start smoking it with no one noticing. It's absurd. I think some of these rules are silly. They're old. They're antiquated. When they came in place, no one knew how dispensaries were going to function. No one knew the role of cartels. No one knew the role of the illegal market, the legal market, how safe and secure they are. But again, like I said, we all just kind of finally got good with medical. Everyone was feeling really good. Now adult use. And now I think it's up to the industry to continue to do the great job that they have, continue to provide the safe and secure environment, continue to behave like professionals. Well, most of them, right, Demitri? Not all of them, not pointing any fingers. But most of my clients and behave in, they're business people. Like Demitri, I'm not a consumer of marijuana, cannabis. I like my bubbly rosé. I come home from work after a long day with my 3 children. I'm not a consumer, and I think it's normalizing that, right? The ex-mayor of Gilbert, Jen Daniels, who is lovely in economic development, she's fabulous. And one day she asked, because we're both moms and we're about the same age, why do you do this? Why do you work in this space? And I said, because everyone deserves good representation. And frankly, who do you want representing the marijuana industry, to use Dimitri's term, or the cannabis industry? You want a good lawyer. You want someone who understands land use. You want someone who's respectful of the council. You want someone who's respectful of Arizona Department of Health Services, understands law, and will also tell their clients to stay in their lane. I'm not afraid to say, stay in your lane, especially in this environment where we're still in, that Kris was talking about, where it's illegal federally. I tell my clients once a week, you're either a drug dealer or you're a functioning part of the legal medical marijuana or adult use establishment program. And if you take one step out of your lane, you're a drug dealer, and I can't help you. So mind your P's and Q's. Don't be a ding dong. You guys said I can't use that word, but there we go. It's already out there, ding dong. Don't be a ding dong.
I forgot to get my bleep clicker so we could bleep out all your ding dongs.
If I may, real quickly, Sean, as Lindsay was talking about what people have at stake, and there's only 130 umbrella licenses in Arizona, now 143 as of yesterday. They state issued 13 more without actually recognizing the equity value of those licenses and how it actually belongs to the citizens of Arizona, but that's a whole nother subject. Those licenses are worth between $17 and $22 million for the paper alone on the open market, right, secondary market right now in Arizona. So people are not willing to risk that by screwing up. And so they're very likely to mind their P's and Q's. Every organization has a compliance officer, working hard to make sure, and working with their attorneys to make sure that they don't become at risk of having the regulatory agency of DHS come down on them and revoke their license. So.
And Demitri, in case anyone at AZDHS is listening, you and I both know the nonprofits aren't worth anything. It's the management company, and then people nicely just, move up and down off the boards. We also have a complicated corporate structure here that hopefully will all get fixed. Adult use, thankfully, allowed all of our nonprofit medical marijuana dispensaries to become for-profit, and so. But Demitri,
these licenses have grown in value from the $5,000 that was originally required by the state in August 2012. Immediately, transactions started occurring for $300,000 in 2012, and now those transactions have grown slowly over time, and they do occur. So I'm just, I use layman terms. It's not important to me what the law is. It's just important to me to tell the truth and explain to people what really happens. But I love DHS.
I'd like to bring Andrew into the conversation here. Andrew, I wonder if you have a unique perspective as somebody who sits at the municipal level and really interacts with not only folks like Lindsay, but also folks like, Kris on the ownership side. From your perspective, Andrew, how can the municipalities, well, first of all, how do municipalities benefit from having a cannabis facility in their midst? And what can the municipalities do to help, foster this process, not only of implementation on the operator side, but also on the community side, and foster a dialogue so that you don't get a lot of fear mongering and NIMBYism that's going to disrupt an otherwise a great opportunity for a city or town.
Sure, thanks, Sean. And those are great questions, and I've really appreciated all of the comments from everybody. When I came out to the Santa Rosa in 2016 and 2017, then I became involved in our medical cannabis ordinance and both participated in crafting policies as well as implementing the policies. And then in 2018, then that was, we added adult use to medical cannabis. And so when in that process, then what we did was, that's when we created what we refer to as our comprehensive cannabis ordinance. So that then established policies for any type of cannabis land use, and then how we would begin the process of implementing those land use regulations and subsequent permitting requirements and such. So I think that what was very important was at the local level, we had a cannabis subcommittee of the city council. And that subcommittee met monthly. They responded to questions, both that were being raised as policy was developed and being drafted, but then also in response to the community. So there was a couple of years of process that was very open and very transparent. And I think that was important to the eventual success, but also sort of the steadfastness of our comprehensive cannabis ordinance in implementation over the last 2 years. So, City Council was very clear about the economic development benefits of legalization of cannabis, and then support for the cannabis industry locally, and was also very clear about the benefits of legalization of cannabis to reduce, illegal activity, to increase safety and security within our communities by legalizing and regulating other, illegal industry uses. And I think that was very important. So it was two-pronged. I mean, it wasn't, it was both looking out and respecting the needs of the community and where the community was at, as well as the economic development potential of the cannabis subsector within our local economy. And so I think that that's what really laid the bedrock for the success of our comprehensive cannabis ordinance. We often tell both applicants, community, and folks who are on the panel and within the audience today, that the goal of our comprehensive cannabis ordinance is to treat cannabis land uses like we would treat any other land use in the city, any non-cannabis land use, to the greatest extent possible. And so when you look at our ordinance and you look at our land use permit requirements, you find that they closely mirror the requirements of our non-cannabis light industrial land uses. The important exceptions are in the areas of odor mitigation, because we recognized a unique situation there, as well as security, which is part of state cannabis law, and our local requirements for security align very closely with state law. So in those two important areas, the cannabis ordinance and our treatment of cannabis land uses does differ from non-cannabis land uses. And I think that we probably have a bit of a heightened level of conditional use permit requirement for adjacencies to residential uses. But outside of that, and outside of the fact that we do have an overconcentration policy for our cannabis retail land uses, the overall policy and how we approach those uses then tracks very closely with our non-cannabis uses. And I think that's been important for economic development purposes, because what that has resulted in then is the cannabis industry sees Santa Rosa as a very fair playing field, where they will not be, we don't have additional review committees, we don't have additional fees, we don't have additional requirements. And I think they appreciate that fairness and the equity that we bring to the process, using equity certainly from a different perspective there. But so that's been very important for the industry, but it's also been very important, I think, for our approval processes, as it's allowed our review authorities to be very confident in the decisions that they're making when necessary, and when approving land uses, because council was very clear on the reasons for legalizing cannabis. So I think, in retrospect now, it seems like it's been a lifetime that we've been operating under the comprehensive cannabis ordinance. And I think, as everyone could imagine, the industry changes very quickly. It's a very young industry, and it evolves. And I think evolution is an important part of the conversation and how you craft those expectations. But at the same time, to be very certain and have those bedrock certainties about why you're doing this is, I think, important for local jurisdictions for long-term successes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Sean, if I could tell a quick story that
Please.
would really relate directly to this subject. I sat in the council office with Cunningham in Tucson back in 2011 when all these activists came through, great individuals like Krane, who knew more than I did, and were explaining to us what cultivations and dispensaries would look like. And we met with the police chiefs, the city attorneys, et cetera, and we pulled ordinances out of thin air. We literally, it's kind of the most embarrassing thing I've ever done in my life. We pulled these ordinances out of thin air that we thought would be appropriate for the industry. We had to create a medical marijuana ordinance. 2012, the industry came through. I left and joined the industry and started to study it and learn and understand it. In 2013 and 14, a number of dispensary owners came to me and said, I'd love to place my cultivation in Tucson, but they have a 2,000 square foot canopy limit. Phoenix has unlimited, Arivaca has unlimited. I want the jobs to go to Tucson. I want my cultivation to be in Tucson. So I went to Fimbres and Cunningham and I said, look, guys, you guys understand economic development and jobs. We screwed up. We had no idea what we were doing. We created this ordinance that is extremely restricted for cultivation in Tucson. And they said, okay, what do we do? I said, just open it up. And so 2014, they changed it. They opened it up. And since then, I don't know, some 5-7 cultivations employing some 400 to 600 individuals have been created in Tucson. Had we not done that, those cultivations would be in other parts of Arizona. So it's important to know that you don't know what you don't know and contact people who do know. I just helped teach and share development services at Tucson. They didn't listen to all my advice. I suggested there's going to be massive opportunities both now and as interstate evolves in manufacturing and cultivation. Not all uses are the same. Dispensaries have other things. And I gave them extremely good advice as to how they could implement their ordinance. And so you really need to reach out. And I offer my services for free to anyone whose job it is to make Arizona a better place for all of us. There's plenty of money in the cannabis industry. And I try to look at things like Arizona is my home, and ultimately we need good policy. But economic development is my favorite thing. So just feel free to pass on my name to anyone, and I'll share with them how to make the most money off cannabis.
Well, thanks, Demitri. You and Andrew make similar points that I'd like to conjoin here into the next question. So both of you point out the sort of the dynamic nature of the industry. Andrew, you make the point that rules are constantly needing to change and evolve to the realities, sometimes anticipated, sometimes not, of implementation. Demitri, you make a similar point about the Arizona body of laws around this and how they're constantly in flux. Kris, this is a question for you. We have the benefit of being able to, we have a few canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, in the form of California, Colorado, and Washington. I mean, there are obviously other adult use states, but those are kind of I would posit those are the big boys in the room. Can you speak for a moment, Kris, on some of the lessons that the industry has taken from their example, good, bad, and ugly, and how those programs have evolved over the course of, gosh, almost a decade now, I guess, and more when you talk medical.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We kind of point out, people love to sort of point to California as like, hey, what can we learn from California? And I mean, by and large, and certainly no offense to Andrew, and he's very much in the municipal side of things, but like I generally tell people, like, California is a great example of how not to do legalization. It is overly cumbersome. There are way too many license classes. The tax rate's too high. It's really difficult for people to navigate the regulatory environment in California, and that's part of the reason why here we are 4.5 years after the initiative passed, and still most of the program, and most of the state at least, right, the program's not really rolled out yet. It's still not a mature adult use industry yet. And to be fair, California has some issues that, and Oregon and Washington as well, right, have some issues that you don't really have in other states, and that there is a massive and robust traditional or illicit market in those states. That product does make its way east, but by the time it gets to the East Coast, it's a lot more expensive than it is in California. And so, the cost of, the price of eliminating the illicit market or reducing the illicit market, but you got to get that cost down way lower in California and Washington, Oregon than you do in certainly somewhere like Arizona, definitely when you're talking about the Midwest or the East Coast. But I do think California, unfortunately, is it's way too complicated and way too cumbersome in general. I don't think there's a reason for licensing to be this complicated and this difficult. But there certainly are. I mean, there's lessons we can learn from everywhere, and I think it's been interesting watching over the last few years as the state legislatures have taken over this process as opposed to the advocates running ballot initiatives. What lessons they're learning from other states and what kind of things they're trying to make sure get implemented in their laws. We look at something like social equity. That's been a huge point of contention in these state legislatures in terms of how do we ensure that these communities that have been disproportionately impacted by prohibition have an opportunity to participate in the new legal markets. And there, I think Massachusetts is probably the first state to really attempt to address this issue. By giving priority in licensing. And this is not a limited license state, right? It's a rolling process. There isn't a cap on the number of licenses. So these aren't competitive application processes, but they give an advantage in licensing to anybody who is a qualified social equity or economic empowerment applicant, meaning it's generally people who come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted or that are below, below the poverty level, or have been convicted of a cannabis offense in the past, which on a personal note, I think is a great policy, right? If somebody got caught up in the web of cannabis prohibition, and now we're saying that we're going to be giving people licenses to engage in the exact same behavior, right? We should be allowing them to move into the legal industry as well. The problem in Massachusetts, and I think this one is particularly relevant to what we're talking about here, the problem that happened in Massachusetts is they had a generally well-designed program, and they didn't have license caps, which I would generally advocate against license caps in general. I think the market's plenty well equipped to determine who are good operators and who aren't, and I don't think that we should be artificially limiting the number of licenses in any state, although that does tend to generally be the trend. In Massachusetts, they didn't limit the number of licenses, but they gave too much authority to the municipalities, in that in order to have a complete application to get a license at the state level, you have to have signed a host community agreement with your municipality in order for your application to be deemed complete and to be granted a license. The problem with that, and look, it's well-intentioned in terms of they want the municipalities to have some sort of say in how many licenses they have in their towns and who gets those. And I understand that. My argument would be municipalities already have that authority through the zoning process. And what this did was add another layer on top of zoning where the municipalities effectively get to pick and choose the winners before the state does, which has made it very difficult for some of the smaller business operators, the social equity operators in particular. Like, just think about it. If you're 29-year-old, a black male from Dorchester in Boston who had been convicted of a cannabis offense, and you're going into a town outside of Boston, asking them for a host community agreement, they're going to go like, we don't know you, and you've got an offense on your record, and we're not going to deal with you. Oh, and by the way, in order to get a host community agreement, right, you've got to agree to pay up to 3% of your sales off the top to the town, and you can add all these other benefits. And so the companies that have more money are able to offer more to these towns, and they're more likely to get these host community agreements. But it's also served as a de facto ban, or the ability for towns to de facto ban, because there's nothing that says that they have to grant these. It's not like a use permit process where, and this is obviously, this is sort of Lindsay and Andrew's world, right? But if you apply for a special use permit for a cannabis business in a town, the town can reject you. But if you have checked all the boxes, right, there's very specific criteria that an applicant has to meet. And if you have checked all those boxes, right, there's an appeal process, and likely there's a good chance you're still going to be able to get that, even if the town doesn't really love you for some reason. For host community agreement, as long as they don't say we don't want cannabis in our town, they can pick any reason they want to deny, and there's no recourse there. And so if a town doesn't really want one, they just reject them for everybody. Or if the town is mandated to have a certain number, they can just grant one and then not grant any more. And it's really limited participation, especially from small business operators. I guess the last thing I would add is, something that I think we're starting to see more of on this front, and I think Illinois has done on theory has done a good job of it, is saying if you're a medical state that's transitioning to adult use, I think it is good practice to allow the existing medical operators to get up and running as quickly as possible, to start getting product into the market, to start that process of weaning down and eliminating the illicit market as you start licensing new businesses on top of that. And what Illinois did was said, we're going to let these existing companies get open. We recognize it means that there's going to be product shortages at first, right? Because there hasn't been enough time to ramp up production, but we'd rather have product shortages than have no product available at all. And that the tax revenue that we generate from these existing medical now converted businesses will go to fund the next round of social equity licensees that we'll be licensing in the next year. And that's still in process. The problem is they did a fairly competitive process. There's now lawsuits, which you see in basically every time you have a competitive application process, they wind up in litigation. I also don't think that Arizona's straight lottery is necessarily the way to go either. I think a qualified lottery is probably a better solution, where you set that bar at a reasonable level, but not so high that people can complain that they were unfairly kept out. That seems to me the best way to go. But then you can use all of that money that's collected from these initial operators to go ahead and fund the next round of operators, which I think, by way of policy, should be geared towards smaller businesses, equity licensees, right? People who've had a harder time getting into this industry, or who may have been harmed by legacy of prohibition.
Yeah, just real quickly, a little inside baseball that anyone who's concerned about economic development that's happening right now in Arizona is there's a push that I'm being told is being led by certain union individuals to convince city councils, Democratic city councils, and I saw it happen in Tucson. It's happening in Flagstaff and Phoenix and Tempe, to create exactly what Kris is talking about. It's a secondary licensing for the social equity licenses that are going to be issued in the fall. And get me in the same room as them, and let's have a debate in front of your politicians as to how that will work, because Kris is exactly right. It creates an unnecessary burden or hoop for people to jump through when the state's already doing that. So, but they're well intended.
So here's a question for Lindsay and also for Andrew. Lindsay, in your capacity as an attorney who's done a lot of zoning work in the cannabis space, what do you do when you run into, you go into a conference room and across the table are folks who are not amenable to cannabis, and you have to get your clients, appropriately zoned and up and operating ASAP? How do you navigate that conversation? And then Andrew, I'd be interested to hear your take as, potentially the person on the other side of the table from Lindsay. But let's start ladies first with Lindsay.
Thank you, Sean. Such a gentleman. It's complicated. It's hard. I will tell you, you give me the best zoning case in marijuana, and I tell you, you've got an 80% chance. Ryan Hurley and I used to say right from the beginning, you give me something that I think, in normal land use should have no issue. Andrew, I liked hearing from you that you look at it from a, you seem like a land use zoning purist, which I wish more jurisdictions were. This is like widgets. When it's cultivation or infusion, Andrew hit the nail on the head. As long as my clients have proper odor mitigation, say thank you. Say thank you for jobs. Say thank you for buying, underserved industrial real estate that's sitting, all around this state that needs to be purchased, where we can employ people. So Sean, I try to to talk from a logical standpoint, like it sounds like we all are here, and the economics, right? People need jobs. These are fabulous employers. People need to sell their or rent their industrial real estate or retail real estate. And then I really do talk about the safety and security. A lot of my clients like to get into the, and Kris, you've hit a bit on it, and I'm sure, Demitri, you could talk about it, but how the illegal use goes down once there's a certain amount of legal use, but you have to balance that with the taxes. And that's a whole conversation that I leave more to my client. I'm not here advocating for marijuana or cannabis per se, but from a land use perspective, you either have a retail use or you have an industrial use that has a proven track record, at least in Arizona, of being very, very safe and secure. I bring out the statistics. I've got a fabulous chart that I'd share with anyone. Demitri, I don't know if you've seen it, that the Tempe Police Department did when they were doing one of their text amendments. And they talked about the crime rate at CVS. The crime rate at CVS, at University and Mill, is awful. I will send it to all of you. Liquor stores and the dispensaries. And the dispensaries just aren't having the stereotypical problems that you would think you'd have. So I try to get statistics, real life stats. I try to just pump the fact that we have had a successful program here in Arizona. But I love hearing people like Andrew and the professionals and the council people who do understand, who understand. Now, I will say, in Arizona, we just had Tatum and Shea that was mildly controversial. There was a request for a dispensary up there, and that was a rezoning. And a rezoning is a legislative action. So Kris, as opposed to a use permit that you were kind of touching on, where it's more of a test, more quasi-judicial, you have to meet certain criteria. A rezone is a legislative action, and they can do whatever they want. Council people can. The community came out at Tatum and Shea and said, we don't want it in C1. We just don't. And that's allowed, so I think council has the right to listen to their citizens. That's what they're elected to do. But it's an education, Sean. And, from a medical standpoint, I'll tell you, I used kids all the time as a mom. My mind was turned early on with kids that need this. There is a serious medical need. And from an adult use perspective, if I'm going to drink my bubbly rosé, well, why can't someone else smoke a joint?
Sorry. My bad.
Thank you, Lindsay. I wonder, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind picking up the thread from here and just give us your perspective on, how municipal leadership can navigate these, what can become very politically sticky situations when it comes to, figuring out who goes where and who doesn't.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think that we benefit from having some, as a regulatory agency and conducting a discretionary review or requiring, I guess, discretionary entitlements for certain cannabis land uses. It depends on how you write those regulations and the amount of discretion that's provided in those regulations. So, your regulations can be very clear and be very onerous and set the bar very high, or the regulations could be less clear and provide a lot of discretion within those regulations. I think that from our perspective, I really think that we struck a good balance between providing objective criteria in our regulations and then allowing for that discretion to be used appropriately by our review authorities, our planning commission primarily, but then we also have a zoning administrator level as well. So that's really made a difference for us. I think that we appropriately analyzed the potential impacts and acted accordingly in crafting the ordinance, and that's made a lot of difference. It's given the market some certainty in terms of what to expect for sure, but then it's also allowed us to ensure that you know, proposed land use is appropriate for the particular zoning district. So I will say that when, you know, when we look across all of our cannabis land uses, they're primarily, all of the cannabis land uses are allowed in our industrial zoning districts. So that right there lends itself to kind of an appropriate environment for any cannabis land use, especially when you think about the manufacturing and you think about some of the odor and security issues that you're trying to address. And then for our retail dispensary land uses, those are allowed both in certain commercial zoning districts and all of our industrial zoning districts. So again, a little bit of a tightening on the cannabis retail land uses, and then the overconcentration, which does not allow retail within 600 feet of one another. And then, of course, applying state law requirements as far as distance from schools, K through 12. So that had the effect of limiting where retail dispensary land uses could be located, but doing it in a way different than limiting the number of permits that we might issue. And so it alleviated creating that sort of competitive environment, or that environment that is almost highly subjective in a way. So again, I think it was just balancing of what we were trying to achieve with the ways of going about it. And I think being fair to everybody, including our review authorities, I think, to not put them in a position to have to be highly subjective about a decision that they're making.
Thank you. I have a question here from the town of Camp Verde and their economic development department. I want to put to the crowd, and I'll let you all decide who's the best one to answer this question. But here's the question from the town of Camp Verde's economic development department. We have 7 grow facilities in our small community, but we're having a difficult time measuring the economic impact of jobs, investments, et cetera, at Camp Verde. Can someone please provide us some assistance in how the economic impact is measured? They're having a little challenge in aggregating and analyzing data, sounds like. Is there somebody that would like to take this one on?
I can always help a little bit. I'm not a specialist in measuring economic impact, but you don't have to be a specialist to, approach them, and ask them questions as about what their economic impact is, what they think their economic impact is, how many people they employ, where these people are living, and all those questions that economic development analyzers would ask. Most dispensaries, cultivations, manufacturing sites, which are going to be an emerging thing in jurisdictions here henceforth, will be more than willing to participate and share data for those purposes. This is a very transparent industry. I can help make some introductions if necessary, but the science of measuring economic impact is not my specialty, but I can promise you that these are 7 places that probably would remain unused. These are questions that they have to answer for themselves as to what it would be like if these facilities were not there.
Thanks, Demitri. Another question, and maybe Kris, maybe you could take this one on, just given your national view and vantage. But what are some of the biggest myths that cities and individuals have, maybe pre, during, post, legislative change? And can you talk to what some of those fears and misconceptions might be, and how to dispel them?
So fears that communities may have about impending legalization.
I think that's right. Communities, both on, from a municipal leadership perspective and also from a citizenry perspective.
Sure. There's always quite a lot. There's definitely a divergence between people who vote for legalization and then who are okay with having it in their town. NIMBYism is very, very real in this industry. I've seen it in every state, and I find it actually even in, particularly in sort of more affluent but very progressive communities, right? People like to think of themselves as progressive-minded thinkers. They just don't really want it in their backyard, and that tends to be a big problem. I also would say, and I think that the municipal experts here can speak to this better than anybody, is you don't always have to listen to the loudest voices in the room. You could get a bunch of like angry moms showing up to a zoning meeting with pitchforks and torches, and it really scares the hell out of the zoning officials, or can often scare the hell out of the zoning officials. But those voices are generally not representative of the community at large. They're just the angry ones, and the angry ones are more likely to actually show up in person and be loud. I think that the biggest concerns that we see from municipalities are issues of quality of life concerns, right? Is having a dispensary in town going to mean that people are going to be smoking weed in the streets all day, and my kids are going to have to smell it when they're walking to school? And traffic concerns that's actually a much more legitimate concern. I mean, we just don't, because public consumption isn't really allowed, or you don't see people going to dispensaries, hanging out outside, smoking weed outside, right? Like, there's really good security around that kind of stuff. Doesn't really increase the amount of public consumption in any particular town. I will say, I mean, if we're being perfectly honest, right, legalizing an entire state, you're probably going to smell it a little more often than you did before it was legal. But so what? Like, it doesn't impact anybody's life. And it's not like a massive increase. It's not like every time you leave your house, you're going to smell cannabis smoke in the streets. It's just a little bit more common because it's now a lot more legal. And that's part of the point. But we've not seen anywhere all of a sudden the teenagers in town are all hanging out in the schoolyard smoking pot after school, like that. Those types of like apocalyptic type scenarios that you hear from folks at places like Project Sam just have not played out anywhere. Traffic concerns are a real one, especially when it comes to smaller towns, smaller municipalities that may have the only dispensary within a fairly large radius. You do say that when a lot of towns have bands around it, and you've got one that's near there, that town may not be well equipped to handle the kind of traffic that they're going to get from those retail shoppers. So it's not the people that are like hanging around loitering and smoking on the street. It's simply handling this intersection. We're not used to having this many left turns right at this intersection into this parking lot, and those are things that can be mitigated through zoning zoning restrictions. You definitely see concerns about how is this going to impact kids, and I think the panelists have addressed this really well, that the dispensaries don't sell to people who are underage because these licenses are hugely valuable, and the regulators tend to look for that because that is such a concern. And so like diversion to young people is not much of a concern, and I would say it's actually less of a concern than it is for alcohol, where there is some diversion that goes on with alcohol, right? A teenager who's got an older sibling might go out and buy a few 6-packs and give it to the teenager. Like, that stuff is going to happen in society, but the reality is those teenagers that were looking for cannabis were finding it before it was legal. And in fact, they were finding it a lot easier than most of society before it was legal, because every high school in America has a pot dealer. They're not asking for ID at the point of sale, right? And we're not able to track those purchases. We know exactly, know exactly who's getting it. Those products aren't tested. So I think we have to deal with the realities. But unfortunately, sometimes I think we see restrictions put in place to solve problems that don't exist. And Lindsay spoke, I think, really well to this on the issue of setbacks from pre-K or even kindergartens and middle schools. And I'll give you an example to close this out with, one that we dealt with at Forefront. Sean, you might remember this one, when we were trying to get zoning approval in the city of Burlington, Massachusetts, and this was a town where we had full-scale support from the city council. We had gotten our letter of support, right? Seemingly everybody was in favor, but you had a zoning board that was run by a woman there who was vehemently anti-cannabis and sort of unwilling to work with companies on minor issues. And so we wound up with a situation where there was really only one building that was available in their zone, which we had secured, and it was because they judge the setback requirements property line to property line, rather than front door to front door, it was 997 feet away from a King's Bowling. For those who don't know King's Bowling is one of those like fancy bowling alleys that have a full bar and restaurant in it, right? So this is a bar, right? They serve alcohol there, and they hold kids' birthday parties on Saturday afternoons. And so the city determined that this was a place where kids congregate. Therefore, it qualified under the 1,000-foot setback, and we were 997 feet away from the King's Bowling Alley parking lot from a bar, across a 2-lane highway, right? 2 lanes on either side with a major divider in between, the main thoroughfare through town. There's no way some middle school kid is going to stumble out of this bowling alley bar, stumble across 4 lanes of 50-mile-an-hour traffic across the divider, wind up in our dispensary, and somebody's then going to sell him a joint to walk out with. Like the problem that they were trying to solve for was so absurd and simply non-existent, and yet it's the kind of thing that we see repeated over and over and over again. It is not a Massachusetts issue, right? This is just a municipal issue in legal states that I think as towns get more comfortable with the idea of regulating cannabis commerce in their towns, right, these things will start to get rolled back a little bit. But right now, there's just a lot of solving for problems that don't really exist.
Kris, I'm sorry, Andrew, I had a bowling alley problem too. Bowling alley, people are drinking. There's a better chance that the kid is going to get a beer or a vodka soda as opposed to, and traffic. It drives me insane as someone who's a mom. Like, I get it. And I love that your example of the moms with the pitchforks. Are moms just scary? We just come in with our pitchforks and we tout our kids.
Angry. I don't know anybody that scares municipal officials more than angry moms.
I think a couple of thoughts. One related to data. It was very interesting to work on policy development in an industry where there was very little data, about what would be trip generation for retail dispensary use, that's new to a municipality, and how do you solve for some of those situations where we didn't have the data we needed to support some of the decision making that needed to happen to respond to legalization at the state level. That was an interesting process, and I recall that ITE had published a trip generation rate for cannabis retail dispensary that was based, I believe, upon trip generation for a drive-through pharmacy use or operation, and it seemed quite high, and it's especially when you consider a situation where you're like, we have cannabis use as prevalent in our general region and is typically accepted. We're not near a state line where the state adjacent to us does not have legalization of cannabis. So there were certain factors that you had to kind of look at and use your best judgment on how you were going to approach something. So we did that, but then locally there was a transportation engineering firm that collected their own data and have been using that in their traffic studies then subsequently. So I thought it was interesting how a non-cannabis entity kind of stepped in and filled a niche for something that was really quite needed in terms of land use approvals, and found it valuable to be to generate that data for the industry and be able to use it. Now, certainly in their case, it's proprietary, so it's not like they released it for anyone to use, but it has been very helpful locally. So there was that thought. But then the other thing too, I think is oftentimes I think that there has to be a balancing act where you have opposition in a community, where you don't have sort of an open arms acceptance of cannabis. And I do feel that balancing act reflects sometimes in the state level policy that guides it. And I don't know if I said that exactly the way I want to, but sometimes I think we did have to see a balancing of pro-cannabis supporters and then anti-cannabis objectors. And how do you balance that? And I think then when we look at some of those setbacks from schools, it was really more crafted to balance proponents and opposition, but to move it forward to some degree, rather than allow it to stall out. And maybe through time, then we see some of these restrictions or that don't get proven with the longitudinal data, to see them rolled back then.
Sean, if I may make a quick comment, I have to deal with Republicans, Democrats, politicians, ultimately all the time, last 9 years in Arizona. So my credibility is everything to them, to me, and for them. Otherwise, I'm not getting in the door. We're not going to have an intelligent talk about cannabis policy. Some of my marijuana cannabis advocate friends might not like this, but I always tell people, Kris made some incredible points. Everything Kris says is true. Everything Kris says is spot on. But if you and as Andrew was saying, sometimes there's a balancing act. And the real truth of cannabis policy is, in no world does prohibition work for anyone. The 10% that consume for therapeutic reasons, for medical reasons, for adult use, choice, recreational reasons, whatever, are going to transition into the market, and it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar market. There's plenty of money to be made. If you want to focus on something and feel like you're doing something at the local, state, federal level, focus on advertising, marketing, and messaging and education about what responsible cannabis use is. That's something that the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry or the coffee industry never did. I mean, I personally realize how much people abuse coffee over the years. But coffee is a great therapy. I'm drinking coffee too over here. I'm medicating myself over here, and people have that right. But if they really want to feel like they're doing something, and I'm trying to share this to be fair to both sides, focusing on where the marketing, advertising, and messaging should be in the community or at the state, federal level, but don't just help unravel prohibition and make it convenient for the business that does exist to function. That's my final thoughts on cannabis if I were to die tomorrow.
Well, we hope we don't die tomorrow, but
Thanks
for the parting words. Yeah. Well, it's actually great timing. We're running up against the end of our prescribed time here, and I wonder if maybe we couldn't go around the horn before we finish up, and just if each of the panelists maybe could leave us with a final thought on Arizona legalization for adult use, and from your perspective, again, maybe just a parting thought on what it means to Arizona, and how do we, as Arizonans, maximize the opportunity. Kris, maybe you could start us, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I would kind of come back to this point that this doesn't need to be that difficult, right? We have regulatory structures in place for dealing with things like alcohol, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel with everything, with everything when it comes to cannabis. Not that cannabis is alcohol; it's not. It's far safer, and probably should be treated as such. This is not, uranium or plutonium or any kind of crazy substance, right? We have lots of experience in lots of states that we can draw on to understand what works and what doesn't work, right? Cannabis has been legal now since 2012 in a number of states, and increasingly more. And last I checked, the sky was still right above our heads. And so I think we need to keep all of that in mind and really treat this with the sort of respect and reasonableness that it deserves. I would again make a plug for making sure that we do what we can to include people who have genuinely had their lives upended due to cannabis prohibition. That those laws have hit Black and Brown communities at a rate that is wildly disproportionate than the rest of the country. And I guess one thing I would throw out there is we hear a lot about what can we do to eliminate the illicit market. And there are a lot of things that we talk about that are all true, right? Making sure that that the tax rate is low enough that that pricing doesn't get too too outrageous, and that there's enough supply licensed so that the natural market forces will bring pricing down, so that it can compete with the illicit market. And all of that's true, right? But I think we tend to focus a lot on the idea of price, and price being ultimately what's going to compete with and eliminate the illicit market. And while there is a lot of truth to that, and we need to think about that as well, we should also be thinking about, how do we take the people who are currently making money in the illicit market and allow them to make money in the legal market? Right? You want to get rid of the illegal market, make the illegal market legal. And that, I don't think is often part of the conversation, but absolutely should be, because cannabis consumers have been enjoying cannabis for a long time, well before it was legal, and that cannabis has been coming from somewhere. And we can't say that, yeah, these people who were arrested for possession, right, they really got a raw deal. They weren't doing anything wrong, right? What they were doing was perfectly fine. We're now recognizing that, and still demonize the people that were producing it and selling it to those people in the first place, right? Those people are not inherently bad people. Sure, if they've been caught up in gang activity or violent activity, or have other things in their past that may preclude them from being involved. But if they were growing cannabis and selling cannabis and supplying it to those of us who enjoy cannabis before it was legal, there should be an opportunity for those folks to transition into the legal markets as well, right? Because they put literally their lives and their livelihoods on the line to provide us with cannabis before this. And I think there needs to be an opportunity for them to participate in these new legal markets.
Thank you, Kris. I mean, we could spend a whole another hour talking about that topic and beyond.
Thinking a lot of those guys don't like to pay taxes and follow regulations, Kris, and that's a problem.
Well, we give them the opportunity to do so, right? Like, don't make the licensing so cumbersome. Don't exclude them through, felony convictions and whatnot. Ultimately, you can't force them into the legal market, but you can provide them an avenue to do it. I don't think any state's really figured out the right way to do that yet.
Mm-hmm. But great parting thoughts. Thanks, Kris. Andrew, I wonder if you might not have some ideas you'd like to share with us before we put a bow on this thing.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So I think like to Kris's point, don't overthink it. You have to look at your situation and such, but don't come down too heavily handed and over-regulate, I think is would be one bit of advice. And then I think that along with that, you have to recognize that this is a rapidly evolving industry. And there's as Demitri has pointed out, as Kris has pointed out, there's great opportunities for growth. And as Lindsay's pointed out, it's we're all learning as we go along. So we have to kind of approach it with the sense that how we're regulating today is likely not how we're going to be regulating 2 or 3 years from now, which is very difficult for municipalities to take the short view, because municipalities, to reduce risk and to introduce certainty, want to take that long view. So I think that kind of goes hand in hand with don't overregulate, because in 2 years, you may be facing rolling back some regulations because the industry has changed. And then also, as Demitri pointed out, there's the industry is full of amazing, fascinating people at many, many levels, from the producers who have 20, 30 years of experience in cloning and best practices and how to produce, to the people that you meet. I know early on we would have people coming up to our counter and wanting to submit applications and asking questions, find out they were coming out of the .com boom, and they saw this as an entrepreneurial business opportunity. It was like the next .com adventure, just in a different industry. But for them, it was about finance, and it was about investment, and it was about business opportunity. It really had nothing to do with the fact that it was cannabis. So at all levels, you've got very interesting people, and you do need to be aware that there are very savvy operators out there, and regulation does matter to them. And cost structures and profit structures do matter to them. So there's I think a lot to take into account as municipalities respond to these opportunities, and you need to be eyes wide open on a variety of fronts.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Thank you for your insight, Andrew. And finally, Lindsay, would you like to have the last word?
I'm certain with this group, it won't be the last word, but in closing, I think it was Demitri that started with it in terms of Canada's legal, Mexico's legal. There's some pressure. I was Canadian. I'm American now, so now I'm dual. But sin tax. I grew up with sin tax. It tax this stuff. Let's make this a great opportunity. There's great opportunity for jobs. There's great taxing potential. And but the conundrum of the federal and state government here in the U.S. is it puts all of our clients, all of our friends in a really bad spot. So I'm hoping that we can do something there. Regulation, Andrew, you hit it. I think we've all hit it. It's evolving, right? At the state level, we're a little stuck here because we've had voter initiatives, and therefore it is harder. Demitri works down there at the state and tries to fix some things. It's harder. We need 75% of the legislature to make changes. But from a local level, the more that we can work on our over-regulation, Andrew, I think here in Arizona, we have over-regulation at the local level. But as it normalizes, as the safety and security, as our highbrow operators continue to operate in the way that they are, I'm hoping that local governments are receptive to continuing that conversation. And last, I'd say in terms of sharing of information, Kris hit the nail on the head that some of our clients have been in this business longer than I have. I've only been in the business since it's been legal, and some people have been in the business longer. And so in terms of trepidation of sharing information and working together, think about where these people are coming from. Again, we've got the .com boomers who are just in it to because they think it's a really solid investment. And we have some people who this has been their business for 40 years, and they're not used to sharing information, especially not with governments. And so I think, kindness, respect, compassion on all sides, as it becomes legal, as it normalizes, we all just need to work together. And I think everybody needs to work together to, it's a great business, and it's widgets. It should be no different than making hats, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just plant one seed, Sean?
Please do.
One last thing. I would encourage jurisdictions, local, county, to actually incentivize in whatever way you can the 130, now 143 manufacturing licenses, 143 cultivation licenses, which are all unlimited canopy, unlimited size, that are available in the state of Arizona, to come to your jurisdiction. This is going to go federally legal. This is a pivotal moment in the history of cannabis for the state of Arizona. If we get these things up and running in our communities, then they will grow, they will have jobs, they will produce products, they will produce flower, and then they'll be shipped out to Alabama or to the other states that are behind on the manufacturing and cultivation as it goes federally legal over the next 10 years. I would highly encourage jurisdictions that want to do economic development to look specifically at this and not just pull back the setbacks, not just make things available, but actually proactively reach out to the cannabis companies and say, what can we do, or their economic development specialists within the jurisdiction, and say, what can we do to cut taxes, lower permits and stuff, so we can host these facilities here? That's an opportunity. And now I'm running for governor of Arizona.
It's a great sentiment to end on. And I'd like to thank Demitri Downing, Andrew Trippel, Kris Krane, and Lindsay Schube for your time and insights. I think the conversation proved to be everything it promised. So thank you all for the time, and on behalf of the Arizona Association for Economic Development, I'm Sean Gallagher. I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and wish everybody a great day.
Happy 420, everyone.